Leopold II never set foot in the Congo, yet he controlled an African territory 76 times larger than Belgium as his personal property. When the global demand for rubber exploded, his officials ordered villages to meet impossible collection quotas. Men spent weeks harvesting rubber instead of growing food, causing famine in many areas. Soldiers took wives and children hostage until enough rubber was delivered. Villages that resisted were burned. Those accused of hiding rubber faced public floggings with the shikot, a whip capable of tearing flesh apart. The force publique was ordered to account for every bullet fired. To prove ammunition had been used on people rather than wasted hunting, soldiers often brought back severed hands. Investigators found baskets filled with human hands collected during military operations. Some were taken from corpses, others were cut from living victims. Entire communities fled into forests to escape raids, starvation, and forced labor. Missionaries reported villages emptied of their populations. By the early 1900s, reports from diplomats, journalists, and missionaries had turned Leopold's Congo into one of the world's first major international human rights scandals. Andrew Jackson became president in 1829 and made the removal of Native American nations one of his administration's central goals. Millions of acres of tribal land in the southeastern United States were occupied by nations including the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole. White settlers wanted that land for farming, cotton production, and expansion. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, allowing the federal government to negotiate the relocation of native tribes west of the Mississippi River. Many of these agreements were signed by small factions rather than the recognized leadership of entire nations. The Cherokee Nation challenged removal in court and won a major Supreme Court case recognizing its rights, but the ruling was not effectively enforced. Federal pressure continued, and thousands of Native Americans were forced from their homes. Families were gathered into camps before beginning long marches to designated territories in present-day Oklahoma. Many traveled hundreds of miles with limited food, inadequate shelter, and exposure to disease. The Cherokee removal became known as the Trail of Tears. Approximately 16,000 Cherokee were relocated, and thousands died from illness, starvation, and harsh conditions during the journey. Cecil Rhodes arrived in southern Africa as a teenager and built a fortune from diamond mining. By the 1890s, he had become one of the most powerful men in the British Empire, controlling vast mining interests and serving as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. Rhodes openly argued that the British were a superior race and believed British rule should expand across Africa. He used political influence and private companies to acquire territory that would later become Rhodesia, named after himself. His British South Africa Company operated with powers normally reserved for governments, including raising armed forces, making treaties, and seizing land. African communities were pushed off valuable farmland to make room for European settlers and commercial operations. Rhodes supported voting laws that restricted political power for Black Africans through property and income requirements that overwhelmingly favored white settlers. Land ownership became increasingly concentrated in European hands while African populations were confined to less productive areas. Armed conflicts followed expansion into new territories. Company forces fought local kingdoms and communities resisting colonial control. Many of these policies became foundations for later segregationist systems in southern Africa. Franco seized power after the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939 and ruled Spain until his death in 1975. His government launched a campaign against people associated with the defeated Republican side, including political opponents, trade unionists, teachers, and activists. Tens of thousands were executed in the years following the war, while many others were imprisoned in camps and prisons across the country. Regional identities became major targets of the regime. The public use of Catalan, Basque, and Galician languages was heavily restricted. Books, newspapers, schools, and government institutions were forced to operate primarily in Spanish. Children were educated under a centralized national identity that discouraged regional cultures. Thousands of political prisoners were used as forced labor on state projects, including roads, railways, and public infrastructure. Critics of the regime faced surveillance, arrest, exile, or imprisonment. Many families spent decades without knowing the fate of relatives who disappeared during political repression. Franco promoted the idea of a single, unified Spain and treated cultural diversity as a threat to national stability. Regional symbols, flags, and institutions were suppressed or banned. By the time of his death in 1975, millions of people had lived under decades of censorship, political repression, and restrictions on cultural expression enforced by one of Europe's longest-lasting dictatorships. Hideki Tojo became Japan's prime minister in 1941 and led the government during some of the most aggressive years of Japanese expansion in Asia. Under his leadership, Japan controlled vast territories across China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific, placing millions of people under military occupation. Japanese military doctrine promoted loyalty to the emperor and often portrayed conquered populations as inferior subjects expected to serve the empire. Occupied civilians were frequently subjected to forced labor, harsh military rule, and severe punishments for resistance. In China, Japanese forces carried out campaigns that resulted in mass civilian casualties. Cities and villages suspected of supporting resistance movements were subjected to collective punishment, executions, and destruction. Millions of Chinese civilians lived under occupation marked by food shortages, forced labor, and military control. Across Asia, hundreds of thousands of civilians and prisoners were conscripted into labor projects supporting Japan's war effort. Many were forced to build roads, railways, airfields, and military installations under brutal conditions. Disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and abuse caused large numbers of deaths. Koreans were compelled to support Japan's war economy through labor mobilization programs, while cultural assimilation policies sought to suppress Korean identity. Throughout occupied territories, local populations were expected to obey Japanese authority while having little political power or legal protection. By the time Japan surrendered in 1945, millions of civilians across Asia had experienced occupation, forced labor, displacement, or military violence under policies implemented during Tojo's government. Ian Smith became Prime Minister of Rhodesia in 1964 and led a government in which a small white minority controlled political power, despite black Africans making up the vast majority of the population. In 1965, he issued Rhodesia's unilateral Declaration of Independence to prevent a transition to majority rule. Voting rights were structured through property, income, and education requirements that overwhelmingly favored white citizens. Although black Africans vastly outnumbered whites, they held only a fraction of the political influence. The most fertile farmland remained concentrated in white ownership, while many black Africans were restricted to overcrowded tribal trust lands with poorer soil and fewer economic opportunities. Large numbers worked as laborers on land their communities had once occupied. As opposition to minority rule grew, Rhodesia became engulfed in a guerrilla war. Security forces conducted counterinsurgency operations across rural areas, creating protected villages and relocation programs that moved hundreds of thousands of black civilians from their homes. Entire communities were placed under surveillance and movement restrictions. The conflict escalated throughout the 1970s, resulting in thousands of deaths among civilians, soldiers, and guerrilla fighters. International sanctions isolated Rhodesia, but Smith continued to oppose immediate majority rule. Benito Mussolini seized power in Italy in 1922 and built a dictatorship centered on nationalism, militarism, and imperial expansion. He argued that Italy needed colonies and launched campaigns to expand Italian control in Africa. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of the few independent countries in Africa. Italian forces used aircraft, artillery, and chemical weapons against Ethiopian troops and civilians. Mustard gas was dropped on battlefields, villages, water sources, and refugee routes, despite international agreements banning chemical warfare. After conquering Ethiopia, Mussolini's government established a colonial system that placed Italians above the local population. Segregation policies limited social interaction between Italians and Africans. Colonial laws restricted rights based on race and reinforced European dominance over land, government, and economic opportunities. In 1937, following an assassination attempt against Italian officials in Ethiopia, occupation forces carried out mass reprisals. Thousands of Ethiopians were killed in Addis Ababa over several days. By 1938, Mussolini introduced racial laws in Italy itself. Jews were expelled from many professions, banned from teaching in public schools, removed from parts of public life, and subjected to increasing discrimination. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933 and built a state around the idea that humanity was divided into superior and inferior races. Nazi ideology placed so-called Aryans at the top and identified Jews, Roma, Slavs, and others as racial enemies. Within months of taking power, political opponents were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Jewish citizens were progressively excluded from public life through laws that stripped away jobs, businesses, property rights, and civil protections. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws revoked German citizenship for Jews and banned marriages between Jews and non-Jews. Children were expelled from schools, professionals lost careers, and businesses were confiscated or boycotted. As Germany expanded across Europe, Nazi authorities created ghettos where Jewish populations were confined behind walls and fences. Victims were transported in packed cattle cars, separated upon arrival, and murdered in gas chambers designed for mass killing. Approximately 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. Hendrik Verwoerd became Prime Minister of South Africa in 1958 and is widely known as the architect of Apartheid, a system that legally separated people by race and assigned different rights to each group. Under his government, race determined where people could live, work, study, travel, and own property. Millions of black South Africans were forced to carry passbooks that controlled their movement. Being found in the wrong area without proper documents could result in arrest, fines, or imprisonment. Entire communities were removed from valuable urban land and relocated to segregated areas. Families who had lived in certain neighborhoods for generations were forced onto trucks and moved because of their racial classification. Verwoerd expanded the Bantustan system, designating fragmented territories as homelands for black South Africans. These areas contained a large share of the population, but only a small portion of the country's land and economic resources. Black South Africans were denied meaningful political representation in the national government. Instead, they were assigned citizenship in these homelands, even if they had never lived there. Schools were separated by race under the Bantu education system. Funding and resources for black students were dramatically lower than those provided to white students. Verwoerd openly stated that black education should prepare people for labor roles rather than positions of leadership. Heinrich Himmler became head of the SS in 1929 and transformed it into one of the most powerful organizations in Nazi Germany. He oversaw the police, intelligence services, concentration camps, and many of the programs that enforced Nazi racial policy. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS identified millions of people as racial enemies of the state. Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others were targeted for persecution, imprisonment, or death. He expanded the concentration camp system across Germany and occupied Europe. Prisoners were subjected to forced labor, starvation, disease, medical experiments, and executions. Many camps became centers of mass death long before the war ended. Himmler played a central role in organizing the Holocaust. SS units under her command carried out mass shootings across Eastern Europe, murdering entire communities. Men, women, and children were gathered at pits, shot, and buried in mass graves. As the killings escalated, Himmler's organization developed extermination camps designed specifically for mass murder. Facilities such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec used gas chambers to kill victims on an industrial scale. The SS also carried out ethnic cleansing programs across occupied territories. Millions were deported, displaced, or killed as Nazi authorities attempted to reshape populations according to racial criteria. By the end of World War II, the organizations Himmler controlled had been responsible for the murder of millions of people across Europe, making him one of the chief architects of the largest state-sponsored genocide in modern history.